Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. It is the hour before dawn, and you are standing on a windswept plateau beneath a sky still heavy with stars. The air is cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of distant cedar forests and the faint metallic tang of iron-rich earth. This is Anatolia, the ancient heartland of a civilization so powerful that it once dictated terms to the mighty pharaohs of Egypt, yet so thoroughly forgotten that for 3,000 years it existed only as whispers in biblical texts and enigmatic references in the archives of other kingdoms. This is the world of the Hittites, a superpower of the Bronze Age that rose from these harsh mountains to command an empire stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the banks of the Euphrates. Tonight you will walk through their capital city of stone and clay. You will stand in the presence of their great kings. You will feel the thunder of chariot wheels on ancient battlefields and hear the prayers whispered in their temples to gods whose names have been silent for millennia. The Hittites were masters of diplomacy and war, pioneers of iron technology, and architects of monumental fortresses, whose ruins still crown the hilltops of modern Turkey. They signed the world's first known peace treaty, carved in silver and sealed with the authority of 1,000 gods. And yet, when their empire fell, it fell so completely that the memory of their greatness was nearly erased from human consciousness. Their language became unreadable. Their cities turned to dust. Their very name became a mystery. It was only in the last century and a half that archaeologists working beneath the relentless Anatolian sun brought their voices back from silence. They uncovered vast archives of clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform script that told a story of ambition, innovation, and ultimately collapse. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Close your eyes and allow yourself to travel back more than 3,000 years, to a time when bronze was the metal of power, when great kings rode to battle in chariots pulled by swift horses, and when the fate of nations was decided not by mass armies, but by the strength of a few hundred elite warriors. Let us journey together to the forgotten empire of the Hittites, to walk the streets of Hattusa, to witness the clash of empires at Kadesh, and to understand how even the mightiest civilizations can vanish like morning mist. Our story begins not with kings or conquests, but with the land itself. The plateau of Anatolia rises from the earth like a great natural fortress.
It is a land of extremes,
Of scorching summers and bitter winters, of fertile valleys carved between ancient mountain ranges. You are standing now in the heart of this plateau, perhaps 1,500 meters above the distant sea. The landscape stretches before you in rolling waves of brown and gold, punctuated by dark stands of juniper and pine. To the south, the Taurus Mountains rise like a wall of stone, their peaks still touched with snow even as the summer sun climbs higher. To the north, the terrain descends gradually toward the Black Sea, through forests of oak and beech, through valleys where swift rivers cut through limestone gorges. This is not an easy land. It does not offer its gifts freely. The soil in many places is thin and rocky. The climate is harsh, with long cold winters and short growing seasons. But for those who learn to read its secrets, Anatolia holds treasures beyond measure. Beneath these hills lie deposits of copper and tin, the essential ingredients for bronze. In the mountains to the east, silver veins run through the rock like frozen lightning. And here, in scattered outcrops and river gravels, you find something even more valuable, something that will give the Hittites a decisive advantage over their rivals. Iron, not the meteoric iron that other ancient peoples occasionally fashioned into ceremonial blades, but true terrestrial iron, drawn from the earth itself. The techniques for smelting it, for heating it in charcoal fires hot enough to drive out the impurities and forge it into tools and weapons harder than bronze, will become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Hittite state. But that knowledge lies in the future. For now, in this moment before history, the plateau is home to scattered farming communities, simple villages of mud, brick and timber, where people speak a language that will never be written down, a language that will be lost when new peoples arrive from the west. These earliest inhabitants, whom we call the Hatti, are not yet empire builders. They are farmers and herders, craftspeople who work copper and clay, who raise barley and emmer wheat in the valleys, who tend flocks of sheep and goats on the hillsides. They live in small settlements, some growing into modest towns with simple fortifications of earth and stone. They worship local deities, spirits of the storm and the sun, gods of the grain and the forge. Their world is small but stable, bounded by the horizon of their valley, measured by the seasons of planting and harvest. They do not yet know that change is coming, that new peoples are moving across the Caucasus Mountains to the northeast, bringing with them new languages, new gods, and new ambitions. The world of the Hatti is about to be transformed. The newcomers arrive gradually, not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow migration that unfolds over generations. They are Indo-Europeans, distant cousins of the peoples who will become the Greeks, the Persians, the peoples of India and northern Europe. They speak a language entirely different from that of the Hatti, a language with its own grammar and vocabulary, its own sounds and rhythms. And crucially, they bring with them the horse and the chariot, technologies of mobility and war that will reshape the ancient world. At first they are simply absorbed into the existing communities, settling in the valleys, learning the ways of farming this difficult land. But they bring energy and ambition. They bring new ideas about leadership and warfare. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the character of the region begins to change. By the 18th century before the Common Era, a new culture has emerged on the Anatolian plateau, a fusion of the indigenous Hatti and the Indo-European newcomers. They will take the name of the land they now rule, calling themselves the people of Hatti, though we know them by the name their neighbors used, Hittites. And they will build a city that will become the heart of their power, a city whose ruins still crown a desolate ridge in central Turkey, Hattusa. You approach this city now, in the early decades of its existence, when it is still growing from a modest settlement into something far grander. The site has been chosen with care. It sits atop a high rocky outcrop, naturally defensible, commanding views over the surrounding valleys. Springs of fresh water emerge from the limestone beneath the hill, a precious resource in this dry landscape. And the location sits at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, linking the Black Sea coast to the north with the rich cities of Syria to the south, connecting the Aegean coast in the west to the highlands of Armenia in the east. As you climb the rocky path toward the city, you can see that it is already beginning to outgrow its original boundaries. New buildings are spreading up the hillside. Defensive walls of rough stone are being raised, though they are nothing compared to the massive fortifications that will come later. The houses are simple structures of mud brick on stone foundations, their walls plastered with clay, their roofs thatched with reeds or covered with wooden beams and packed earth. Smoke rises from cooking fires. You can hear the sounds of daily life, the clang of a coppersmith's hammer, the bleating of goats being driven through narrow lanes, the voices of women calling to children, the deep rumble of carts pulled by oxen over rough cobblestones. The air carries the smell of baking bread, of wood smoke, of animals and leather, and the dusty earth itself. This is not yet an imperial capital. That transformation will require conquest, wealth, and the vision of ambitious kings. But the foundations are being laid. In the center of the settlement on the highest point of the ridge, a modest palace is under construction. Nearby, a temple is being raised to the storm god, the chief deity of this emerging state, the god of thunder and rain, of fertility and war. The rituals performed here blend the old Hatti traditions with the new practices brought by the Indo-European elite. Priests pour libations of beer and wine. They offer bread and meat to the divine images. They chant prayers in a mixture of languages, the sacred words of the Hatti still honored even as the language of power becomes the tongue of the Hittites. And in the archives that will one day be built here, scribes are beginning to record the deeds of kings in cuneiform script, borrowed from Mesopotamia and adapted to write their own language, creating a written record that will survive for 33 centuries, waiting in the darkness of buried ruins for modern scholars to bring it back to light. And so our journey through the world of the Hittites draws to a close. We have walked the streets of Hattusa, felt the cold water from its springs, smelled the bread baking in clay ovens, heard the hammers ringing in the workshops of the arsenal. We have stood in the presence of great kings, witnessed the clash of empires at Kadesh, felt the weight of the storm god's gaze in the rocky sanctuary at Yauzalikiah. We have traced the rise of this impossible empire, built on a harsh plateau far from the centers of ancient civilization, and we have witnessed its fall, sudden and catastrophic, part of the great collapse that ended the Bronze Age world. The ruins of the Hittite Empire still stand in the highlands of Turkey. You can visit Hattusa today, can walk through those same gates flanked by stone lions, can stand where the great temple once towered, can look out from the citadel over the valley where the lower city once sprawled. The stones are weathered now, tumbled in places, but the scale is still impressive. The massive walls still follow the contours of the hills, still speak of the ambition and the achievement of the people who built them. In the museum at Ankara, you can see the treasures recovered from the ruins: bronze weapons and golden jewelry, clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, stone reliefs showing gods and kings, the material culture of a civilization that was forgotten and rediscovered. But what you cannot see, what has been lost forever, are the things that made the Hittites truly human. The conversations in the marketplace, the prayers whispered in the temples, the laughter of children playing in narrow alleys, the negotiations in the palace, the stories told around fires on cold winter nights, the hopes and fears, the ambitions and regrets of individual people whose names we will never know. We can read the decrees of kings, can follow the broad outlines of political history, can understand the systems and structures of their society. But the lived experience of being a Hittite, of waking each morning in that world, of navigating its social hierarchies and religious obligations, of loving and hating, hoping and fearing in the context of that specific culture, that is lost to us, can only be imagined, can never be fully recovered. This is true, of course, of all ancient civilizations. The past is a foreign country, as the saying goes, and the deeper we go into history, the more foreign it becomes. But with the Hittites, the sense of loss is particularly acute because they came so close to complete oblivion. If those clay tablets had not been preserved by the fires that destroyed Hattusa, if 19th century archaeologists had not stumbled upon the ruins, if 20th century scholars had not succeeded in deciphering the language, the Hittites might have remained forever in that twilight realm of half-remembered legends, known only from fragmentary references in the texts of other peoples. We are fortunate that this did not happen, that we can know their story, that we can place them in their proper context as one of the great powers of the Bronze Age. What does it mean that such a powerful civilization could be so thoroughly forgotten? There is a kind of terror in it, a reminder of our own mortality writ large. We like to think that great achievements endure, that significant accomplishments leave permanent marks on history. But the Hittites show us that this is not always true, that empires can fall and be forgotten, that languages can die and become unreadable, that entire civilizations can slip through the cracks of memory. If it could happen to them, it could happen to us. Our own civilization, for all its technological sophistication, for all the vast amount of information we generate and store, is not immune to catastrophe. Climate change, war, epidemic disease, economic collapse. The threats are different in their details but not fundamentally different in kind from those that brought down the Bronze Age world. And if our civilization were to collapse, if our systems were to fail, how much of our knowledge and achievement would survive? Would future archaeologists sifting through our ruins 3,000 years hence be able to reconstruct our history, understand our culture, read our languages? Or would we too become a mystery, known only from fragmentary references, our great cities reduced to tumbled stones, our libraries destroyed, our voices silenced? But there is also something hopeful in the Hittite story. They are not entirely forgotten. We do know their history. We can read their words, understand their achievements, place them in the grand narrative of human civilization. The patient work of archaeologists and scholars has recovered what seemed irretrievably lost. Every clay tablet deciphered, every inscription translated, every site excavated, is a small victory against the oblivion that claimed the Hittites for 3 millennia. It is a reminder that the past can be recovered, that voices can be heard again even after centuries of silence, that memory can be restored even when it seems beyond hope. In this sense, the rediscovery of the Hittites is one of archaeology's great triumphs, a demonstration of what can be achieved through careful scholarship, patient excavation, and the determination to understand the human past in all its complexity. The Hittites were not perfect. They were not saints or heroes from some idealized golden age. They were people, with all the virtues and flaws that implies. They built an empire through conquest, maintained it through force and the threat of force, participated in the violence and cruelty that seemed to be inseparable from the exercise of power in any age. Their legal codes, for all their relative humanity, still recognized slavery, still valued people differently based on their social status, still prescribed punishments that we would consider harsh or unjust. Their religious practices involved animal sacrifice, sometimes on a massive scale. Their wars, however justified they might have seemed to them, caused suffering and death to thousands. We should not romanticize them or pretend they were other than what they were, people of their time, shaped by their culture, acting according to values that are not always compatible with our own. But we can respect their achievements. We can admire the ingenuity with which they built a great civilization in a difficult environment. We can appreciate the sophistication of their legal and diplomatic systems, the beauty of their art and architecture, the complexity of their religious thought. We can learn from their successes and from their failures, can use their history to inform our understanding of how civilizations rise and fall, how empires are built and maintained, how interconnected systems can be vulnerable to cascading failures. And we can remember them, can ensure that they are not forgotten again, that their voices continue to be heard, that their place in the human story is recognized and honored. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you will dream of that ancient world of chariots raising dust on Syrian plains, of great kings negotiating treaties in cuneiform script, of priests chanting prayers in temples decorated with carved reliefs of forgotten gods, of craftsmen working bronze and iron in workshops filled with the smell of charcoal and hot metal, of farmers harvesting barley under the watchful eyes of the storm god, of merchants counting their profits in silver and grain, of all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up the lived experience of the Hittite Empire. Perhaps you will walk through the gates of Hattusa as the sun rises over the plateau, will feel the morning cold on your face, will hear the city waking around you, the sounds and smells of life in a Bronze Age capital. And perhaps in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, you will touch something of the reality of that lost world, will understand in some small way what it meant to live in an age so distant from our own, yet connected to it by the unbroken chain of human experience. The Hittites are gone. Their empire fell more than 3,000 years ago. Their cities are ruins, their language dead, their gods no longer worshipped, but they are not entirely lost. Their story survives, preserved in clay and stone, recovered by the patient work of generations of scholars, available to anyone willing to listen. And in the telling of that story they live again, if only for a moment, if only in imagination. This is what history gives us, not perfect knowledge of the past, not the ability to walk in the shoes of ancient peoples and experience their world exactly as they did, but something still valuable, a connection across time, a reminder that we are not the first to face great challenges, to build civilizations, to create beauty and knowledge and law, to struggle and triumph and ultimately to pass away. We are part of a larger story, a story that stretches back to the beginning of human civilization and forward to whatever future awaits. The Hittites are part of that story, and now, thanks to the rediscovery of their history, we know their chapter. We can read it, learn from it, and pass it on to future generations so that they too will know that once, on a high plateau in Anatolia, there was a great empire, powerful and sophisticated, that commanded armies and signed treaties, that worshipped 1,000 gods, and built cities of stone, that endured for centuries before falling in the great catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age. We can ensure that they are remembered, that their achievements are honored, that their voices, silent for so long, continue to speak. And now our story fades, but the echoes of that ancient world remain. The wind still blows across the ruins of Hattusa, the stone lions still guard their gates, weathered but patient. The clay tablets still wait in museums, still preserve the words of people who have been dead for 3 millennia but whose thoughts we can still read, whose laws and prayers and diplomatic correspondence still speak across the vast gulf of time. The Hittites are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their memory has been preserved, their history recovered, their place in the human story secured, and that perhaps is as close to immortality as any civilization can hope to achieve. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep past, into the world of the Hittite Empire, the forgotten superpower of the Bronze Age. I hope you have found it illuminating, have learned something of a civilization that deserves to be better known, have gained some sense of the richness and complexity of the ancient world. Until our next journey together, rest well, sleep deeply, and dream of distant ages when the world was young and great empires rose and fell like the seasons, leaving behind only stones and silence and the faint echo of voices calling across the millennia. Good night. The rise of Hittite power begins with a name that will echo through their history, though the man himself remains shadowed in the mists of time. Labana. He is remembered as the first great king, the founder of the Old Kingdom, though whether he was a single historical figure or a title given to multiple rulers, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know, from the fragments of texts that survive, is that under his leadership or in his name, the Hittite state transforms from a regional power into an expanding kingdom. The rulers who follow will invoke his name as a title of authority. Thus speaks Labana, the great king, the king of Hatti. They will write at the beginning of their decrees, linking themselves to this legendary founder, claiming his legitimacy as their inheritance. The expansion begins cautiously, at first directed toward the south and east, toward the wealthy cities of Syria and northern Mesopotamia. These are lands of great antiquity, where civilization has flourished for millennia, where the great kingdoms of Yamhad, with its capital at Aleppo, controlled the trade routes linking Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast. The Hittites are still the newcomers, the upstarts from the harsh northern plateau, and they will have to prove themselves in battle against enemies who have been making war since before their grandfathers were born. But they have advantages. They have mastered the art of chariot warfare, coordinating swift-moving vehicles pulled by pairs of horses with disciplined infantry formations. They have access to iron, which they are learning to work into weapons of superior hardness. And they have something else, something less tangible but equally important. A desperate hunger to prove themselves, to carve out a place among the great powers of their age. Under Hattusa, the grandson, or perhaps great-grandson of Labana, the pace of conquest accelerates. You are with the Hittite army now, moving south through the Syrian highlands in the 16th century before the Common Era. The force is not enormous by the standards of later ages, perhaps a few thousand men, but it is formidable. At its core are several hundred chariots, each carrying a driver and one or two warriors armed with spears and composite bows. These are the elite, the aristocratic warriors whose families have served the king for generations. Around them march the infantry, men armed with bronze-tipped spears and large shields of wood and leather, their bodies protected by simple armor of padded linen, or for the wealthiest, bronze scales sewn onto leather backing. They move in disciplined formations, companies organized by region and clan, each following its own banner. The landscape changes as you descend from the Anatolian plateau. The air grows warmer, the vegetation becomes lusher. You pass through orchards of olive and fig, through fields of wheat ripening golden under the sun. Small fortified towns watch nervously from their hilltops as the Hittite army passes. Some send embassies bearing gifts, offering submission to the great king. Others close their gates and prepare for siege. Hattusa is methodical in his conquests. He does not rush. Each city that resists is besieged, its walls battered by siege engines, its gates broken by fire and bronze-headed rams. When the city falls, the population is given a choice: submit and pay tribute, or face destruction. Most choose submission. The wealth of these conquered territories begins to flow northward to Hattusa: slaves and silver, copper and fine textiles, tribute that will fund the construction of the great capital that is to come. But Hattusa's ambitions extend beyond mere territorial conquest. He seeks to make his mark on history, to achieve a victory so spectacular that his name will be remembered forever. His target is the greatest prize in all of Syria, the city of Aleppo, capital of the kingdom of Yamhad. This is one of the ancient world's great metropolises, a city of stone palaces and temples, of bustling markets where merchants from Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast meet to exchange goods. Its walls are massive, built over centuries, reinforced and expanded by generations of kings. Its garrison is experienced and well-equipped, and its king has allies, other Syrian rulers who will come to his aid if the city is threatened. The siege of Aleppo is a brutal affair. It lasts through a full campaign season, perhaps longer. You are inside the Hittite siege camp now, a temporary city of tents and makeshift shelters surrounding the walls of Aleppo. The days are filled with the sounds of war, the crash of battering rams against gates, the shouts of men scaling ladders, the whistle of arrows and slingstones, the screams of the wounded. The nights bring little relief, only the moans of the injured, the smell of blood and sweat and latrine trenches, the restless sleep of men who know tomorrow may bring their deaths. The siege drags on, supplies run low, disease begins to spread through the crowded camp. Some of Hattusa's advisors counsel withdrawal, arguing that the cost is too high, that the city cannot be taken, but the king is determined. He has staked his reputation on this conquest. To withdraw now would be to invite rebellion, to show weakness to his vassals and rivals. Finally, through treachery, or exhaustion, or sheer persistence, the defenses are breached. Hittite soldiers pour through a gate left open by a bribed guard or over walls weakened by weeks of bombardment. The city falls. The sack of Aleppo is terrible and thorough. The palace is looted. The temples are stripped of their treasures. The population is subjected to the ancient and merciless arithmetic of conquest. The skilled craftsmen are taken as slaves, along with the young and healthy who can work or serve. The elderly and infirm are abandoned to whatever mercy remains in a fallen city. The king of Yamhad is captured and executed, or in some versions of the story, taken back to Hattusa as a trophy, to live out his days in comfortable captivity as a living reminder of Hittite power. The city itself, its walls broken, its glory dimmed, becomes a vassal of the Hittite king, required to pay annual tribute and provide troops when the great king calls. But Hattusili's greatest moment is also the beginning of his sorrows. He has conquered an empire, but he has not yet secured a succession. His eldest son, the crown prince, betrays him, perhaps attempting a coup, perhaps simply challenging his authority in a moment of ambition. The exact details are lost, but the outcome is clear. The prince is disinherited, driven into exile or executed. Hattusili turns to his grandson, a boy named Mursili, and designates him as heir. It is a decision born of desperation, and perhaps of hope. The belief that this young prince will prove more loyal than his own son. The old king, broken by war and family tragedy, dies soon after, and Mursili ascends to the throne while still in his youth. What follows is one of the most audacious campaigns in ancient military history. Mursili Abiv, this young and untested king, decides to strike not at nearby targets, but at the very heart of Mesopotamian civilization. He will lead his army south and east, across the Euphrates River, across hundreds of miles of desert and hostile territory, to attack the legendary city of Babylon itself. You march with this army now, a force of chariots and infantry moving through landscapes that grow increasingly alien. You pass through the rolling hills of northern Mesopotamia, through lands controlled by the Hurrian kingdoms, through territories where the Hittite language is not spoken, and where the local rulers regard this army with suspicion and fear. You cross the Euphrates at one of the ancient ford sites, the chariots and men wading through the broad muddy current, the horses nervous in the water, the soldiers holding their weapons and shields above their heads to keep them dry. And then you are in the heartland of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, following the Euphrates south toward Babylon. The journey takes weeks, perhaps months. Supply is a constant challenge. The army must forage from the countryside, requisitioning grain from villages, taking what it needs and leaving promises of payment that will likely never be honored. Messengers ride ahead to scout the route, to watch for enemy forces, to gather intelligence about the great city that is your destination. And finally, after a march that has tested the endurance of every man in the army, you see it on the horizon. Babylon, the city of Hammurabi, the greatest metropolis of the age, its walls rising from the flat alluvial plain, its gates decorated with glazed brick depicting lions and bulls and dragons. The attack on Babylon is swift and devastating. The city, perhaps complacent after centuries of relative peace, is not prepared for an assault from this distant northern kingdom. The Hittite forces, hardened by their long march, hungry for plunder, strike with the fury of desperation. They breach the walls, they storm the gates, they pour into the city like a flood, and for days the streets run with blood and echo with the sounds of looting and destruction. The treasuries are emptied, the temples are desecrated, precious cult statues are carried off as trophies. The Marduk statue, the divine image of Babylon's patron god, is seized and taken north, a symbolic humiliation that will be remembered in Mesopotamian texts for centuries. When Mursili's army finally withdraws, laden with plunder, they leave behind a city in shock, its power broken, its confidence shattered. The date is approximately 1595 before the Common Era, and the sack of Babylon is a moment that reverberates through ancient Near Eastern history. It marks the end of the old Babylonian dynasty founded by Hammurabi. It creates a power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia that will be filled by new peoples, the Kassites, who will rule Babylon for the next 4 centuries. And it announces to the entire ancient world that the Hittites are a force to be reckoned with, a power that can strike across vast distances, that can topple even the most ancient and respected kingdoms. But for all its brilliance, Mursily's triumph is also his undoing. He returns to Hattusa as a conquering hero, the greatest military commander of his age, and almost immediately he is assassinated. The murder is carried out by his own brother-in-law, a man named Hantili, in conspiracy with other members of the royal family. The motives are obscure. Perhaps it is simple ambition, a desire for power. Perhaps there is resentment over the spoils of the Babylon campaign, disputes over who should receive what share of the plunder. Or perhaps it is fear, the same fear that will haunt Hittite politics for centuries. The terror that a successful king with a loyal army might become a tyrant, might overturn the delicate balance between the crown and the aristocracy. Whatever the reason, Mursily dies by violence, cut down in the palace he had filled with Babylonian treasures, and with his death, the Hittite kingdom plunges into chaos. For nearly a century, the Old Kingdom is racked by succession crises and civil wars. Kings are murdered by their relatives, heirs are overthrown by rivals, the aristocracy fragments into competing factions. The empire that Hattusili and Mursily built begins to crumble. Vassal states rebel, trade routes are cut, the wealth that flowed into Hattusili dries up. This is a dark age for the Hittites, a time barely recorded in the historical texts, a period when survival is uncertain and greatness seems like a fading dream. It will take a new dynasty, a new vision of kingship, and a new set of laws to pull the Hittite state back from the edge of collapse. But that renewal lies in the future. For now, in this moment, you witness the terrible cost of unchecked ambition and the fragility of even the mightiest empires. But let us step back now from the halls of power and the clash of armies. Let us walk instead through the streets of Hattusa as an ordinary person might have experienced them. In a time of peace, when the succession struggles have been resolved and the kingdom has entered a period of stability. It is a morning in late spring, and you are waking in a modest house in the lower city, the sprawling residential district that spreads across the valley below the royal citadel. The room is dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through a small window opening covered with a wooden shutter. The air is cool, carrying with it the scent of the limestone dust that seems to permeate everything in this city built of stone. You rise from your sleeping mat, a simple affair of woven reeds covered with woolen blankets that have kept you warm through the night. The house itself is typical of its class, built for a family of modest means, perhaps a craftsman or a minor merchant. The walls are mud brick on stone foundations, plastered inside with clay mixed with straw to give it strength. The floors are packed earth, swept clean daily, covered in places with woven reed mats. The roof is flat, made of wooden beams overlaid with reeds and then covered with a thick layer of packed clay that must be maintained and resealed each year before the winter rains. The structure is simple, a main room that serves as living space and workshop during the day, a smaller room for sleeping, and a courtyard open to the sky where most of the household work is done. In one corner of the courtyard stands a small domed oven made of clay, its interior blackened from years of use. This is where bread is baked, where stews simmer in ceramic pots, where the essential work of feeding the family is accomplished. Your first task of the day is to fetch water. The city has several springs and wells, but they are communal resources, and you must carry your water home in large ceramic jars, balanced carefully on your shoulder or suspended from a wooden yoke. You join the line of other women and children making their morning pilgrimage to the nearest fountain house, a small stone structure built over one of the springs that emerge from the rock beneath the city. The water is cold and sweet, drawn from deep within the earth, pure enough to drink without boiling, though it carries a slight mineral taste from its journey through limestone. You fill your jar listening to the morning gossip, the news of marriages and births, of disputes between neighbors, of what the merchants in the upper city are saying about politics and trade. This is how information flows through the city, in these daily gatherings at wells and ovens, in the markets and workshops, in the casual conversations that bind a community together. Back at the house, breakfast is simple. Flat bread left over from yesterday's baking, perhaps spread with a paste made from chickpeas and oil, accompanied by beer drunk from a ceramic cup. The beer is thick and nutritious, made from barley that has been sprouted, dried, ground and fermented. A staple of the Hittite diet consumed by everyone from the king to the poorest laborer. It is drunk through a straw to filter out the sediment, and it provides calories and vitamins that supplement the grain-based diet. After breakfast, the household disperses to its various tasks. If you are a man, you might head to your workshop. If you are a craftsman, or to the fields outside the city. If you are a farmer who owns or rents land in the surrounding territory. If you are a woman, your day will be spent in the endless round of domestic tasks, grinding grain into flour on a stone quern, a back-breaking labor that must be done daily to produce the flour for bread, spinning wool into thread, using a simple drop spindle, weaving that thread into cloth on an upright loom that stands in the corner of the courtyard, preparing food, mending clothes, supervising children. The city around you is alive with activity. Hattusa in its prime is home to perhaps 40 or 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The lower city spreads across the valley floor and climbs the surrounding hillsides, a maze of narrow streets and densely packed houses interrupted by occasional temples and public buildings. The streets themselves are unpaved, dusty in summer, muddy in winter and spring, following the natural contours of the land, twisting and turning with no apparent plan. Animals are everywhere, donkeys laden with goods, goats being driven to pasture, dogs scavenging for scraps, chickens scratching in the dirt. The sounds are a constant background, the clang of bronze being hammered in a smithy, the rhythmic thud of a weaver's loom, the calls of street vendors selling bread and vegetables, the braying of donkeys, the laughter of children playing some timeless game in a side alley. In the workshop district, specialized craftsmen ply their trades. Potters shape clay on simple wheels, their fingers moving with practiced precision to create the vessels that are essential to daily life. Cooking pots and storage jars, bowls and cups, lamps and censers for burning incense. The clay is local, dug from deposits near the city, mixed with water, and sometimes tempered with sand or crushed pottery sherds to prevent cracking during firing. The vessels, once shaped and dried, are fired in simple updraft kilns, heated by wood fires that must be carefully tended to achieve the right temperature. The pottery that emerges is functional rather than decorative, though some pieces are painted with simple geometric patterns or incised with designs before firing. In another quarter, metal workers labor over their forges. Bronze casting is a sophisticated art, requiring skill and knowledge passed down through generations. The smith must know the precise proportions of copper and tin needed to create bronze of the right hardness and strength. Too much tin and the metal becomes brittle, too little, and it remains soft. The process begins with heating the metals in a crucible until they melt and combine. The molten bronze is then poured into molds made of clay or stone, carefully carved with the shape of the desired object: a spearhead, an axe blade, a dagger, a pin for fastening clothing, a decorative bowl. As the metal cools, it solidifies, taking on the form of the mold. After it has cooled completely, the mold is broken away and the object is filed and polished to remove imperfections. The most valuable items might be further decorated with engraving or inlay. And in a few closely guarded workshops, ironworking is practiced. This is still a relatively new technology, and the methods are not yet perfected. Iron is more difficult to work than bronze. It requires higher temperatures to smelt the ore, and the resulting metal, if not properly worked, is brittle and prone to rust. But the Hittites are learning. They have discovered that by repeatedly heating iron in a charcoal fire and hammering it, they can drive out impurities and create a metal that, while still not as reliable as bronze, has advantages in certain applications. Iron tools can be made with a harder edge. Iron weapons, though more prone to breaking than bronze, are cheaper to produce because iron ore is far more abundant than the copper and tin needed for bronze. The technology is valuable enough that the Hittite kings restrict its export, keeping the secrets of ironworking as a state monopoly, a source of both military advantage and diplomatic leverage. The rhythm of life in Hattusa is governed by the seasons and by religious festivals that mark the turning of the year. In the spring, as the snow melts from the mountains and the first green shoots appear in the fields, there are festivals to ensure the fertility of the crops, ceremonies where the king himself participates, performing rituals that link the human king to the divine order. In the summer, when the grain ripens golden in the fields, there are harvest festivals, thanksgiving offerings to the gods who have provided. In the autumn, as the days shorten and the air grows cold, there are festivals preparing for winter, asking the gods for protection through the harsh months ahead. And in winter itself, when snow blankets the plateau and work in the fields is impossible, there are indoor festivals, gatherings in temples, storytelling and music, the maintenance of community bonds during the season when the outside world is hostile. Food is simple but adequate for most people. The staple is barley ground into flour and baked into flatbreads that are eaten with every meal. Wheat is grown as well, considered finer than barley and used for better quality bread. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans provide protein and variety. Vegetables include onions, garlic, leeks, and various greens. Fruits are seasonal, apples and pears, grapes that are eaten fresh or dried into raisins or fermented into wine, figs that are prized for their sweetness. Meat is not a daily staple for most people, but is eaten on special occasions. Mutton and goat from the flocks that graze the hillsides, pork from pigs raised in villages, beef from cattle that are valuable primarily as draft animals, and are slaughtered only when they are too old to work. Honey is the primary sweetener, gathered from wild bees or from simple clay hives kept near settlements. Cooking is done over open fires or in clay ovens, food boiled in ceramic pots or baked directly in the embers, flavored with salt, herbs, and occasionally imported spices from the south. The social structure of the city is clearly defined. At the top are the royal family and the great aristocratic houses, families whose ancestors served the early kings, who own vast estates in the countryside and hold hereditary positions in the government and military. Below them are the free commoners, craftsmen, merchants, farmers who own their own land, soldiers who have been granted land in return for military service. And at the bottom are the slaves, people captured in war or sold to pay debts, who have no legal rights and can be bought and sold like any other property. But slavery in the Hittite world is not necessarily permanent or absolute. Slaves can sometimes purchase their freedom. They can marry free persons, and their children might be born free. The treatment of slaves varies widely, from the relatively humane households where they are regarded almost as members of the family to the harsh conditions of royal construction projects or mine work. As evening approaches, the city begins to quiet. Workshops close. People return to their homes. The main meal of the day is prepared and eaten as families gather in courtyards or around hearths. The food is served from common pots, eaten with fingers or scooped up with pieces of flatbread. There is conversation, the sharing of the day's news, the settling of household matters, the telling of stories. Children are sent to bed as darkness falls. Adults might remain awake a little longer, finishing tasks by the light of oil lamps, simple ceramic vessels filled with oil with a wick of twisted flax or wool, but fuel is expensive and not to be wasted, so most people retire shortly after sunset. The city grows quiet. Guards walk the walls, watching the darkness beyond. Somewhere in a temple, a priest might be performing evening rituals, offering prayers to the gods for the protection of the city. And in the palace on the citadel, in the royal apartments, the king and his court are engaged in the endless business of statecraft, reading reports from provincial governors, receiving foreign ambassadors, planning campaigns, administering justice. The rhythm continues, day after day, season after season, year after year, the heartbeat of an empire. Now we must return to the realm of kings and empires. For the story of the Hittites is incomplete without understanding how they rose from the chaos of the Old Kingdom's collapse to become one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. The transformation begins with a new dynasty, kings who will institute reforms that stabilize the throne and establish clear rules of succession. They create a system where the king's power is real but limited, balanced by a council of nobles who must be consulted on major decisions. They codify laws that protect the rights of even common people, and they begin the long process of rebuilding the empire, reclaiming lost territories, and establishing Hittite authority over vassal states that had broken away during the period of weakness. By the 14th century before the Common Era, the Hittite kingdom has been transformed into the Hittite Empire, a true great power that negotiates as an equal with the other superpowers of the age. Egypt to the south, the kingdom of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, the rising power of Assyria further east, and the ancient kingdom of Babylon, now ruled by the Kassite dynasty. The king who presides over this golden age is Suppiluliuma, and perhaps the greatest of all Hittite monarchs. His name is difficult for modern tongues, but it would have been spoken with respect and fear throughout the Near East. He is a warrior king and a shrewd diplomat, a man who understands that empires are built not just with swords but with treaties, marriages, and the careful cultivation of loyal vassal rulers. You are in the throne room of the palace at Hattusa now, in the presence of Superpower himself. The room is impressive, far grander than the modest structures of the Old Kingdom. The walls are built of massive stone blocks, fitted together with such precision that no mortar is needed. Some of these blocks weigh several tons, yet they have been cut and placed with extraordinary care, creating walls that will stand for millennia. The interior surfaces are plastered and painted with scenes of royal power, the king receiving tribute, the king leading his army to victory, the king performing rituals before the gods. The floor is paved with stone slabs, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. At the far end of the room, raised on a dais, sits the throne itself, a chair carved from wood and inlaid with ivory and precious metals, cushioned with rich textiles. Superpower himself is an imposing figure, a man in the prime of life, his body hardened by years of campaign and combat. He wears the regalia of Hittite kingship, a long robe of fine wool, dyed in expensive colors, a belt of worked leather studded with bronze fittings, and on his head the distinctive conical cap that marks him as great king. In his hand, he holds the symbols of his authority, a staff surmounted by a sun disk and a ceremonial weapon, perhaps a mace or an axe, representing his role as both shepherd and defender of his people. Around him stand his advisors and officials, the chief scribe, who records his words and manages the vast archives of state correspondence. The commander of the army, responsible for the military forces that enforce his will, the high priest who serves as intermediary between the king and the gods, and representatives of the great noble families, whose support is essential to the stability of the realm. Before the throne, a line of petitioners and ambassadors wait their turn to be heard. There is a merchant seeking royal approval for a trading venture into Assyrian territory. There is a provincial governor reporting on the harvest in his district and requesting a reduction in tribute due to damage from a late spring frost. There are foreign ambassadors, bearing letters sealed with the seals of distant kings, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, in cuneiform script on clay tablets that will be filed away in the archives to be read by scholars 3,000 years hence. Each matter is considered in turn, decisions are made, orders are given, scribes write furiously, recording everything. This is the machinery of empire in action, the daily work of governance that maintains order across a vast territory. But Superpower's greatest achievements are won not in the throne room but on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. His strategic vision is focused on Syria, that rich and contested land where the great powers meet and compete for influence. At the beginning of his reign, much of Syria is controlled by the kingdom of Mitanni, a Hurrian state that has been the dominant power in the region for decades. The Mitanni kings are wealthy and sophisticated, ruling from their capital on the upper reaches of the Euphrates River, commanding a confederation of vassal city-states that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains. But their kingdom is beginning to weaken, pressured from the east by the rising power of Assyria, destabilized by internal succession disputes. Superpower recognizes that this is an opportunity that must not be missed. His strategy is methodical and patient. He does not immediately launch an all-out invasion. Instead, he begins by subverting Mitanni's vassal states, sending embassies to discontented local rulers, offering them better terms if they will transfer their allegiance to Hatti. He marries his daughters and sisters to the kings of strategic buffer states, creating a web of family alliances. He provides military support to Mitanni's enemies, weakening the kingdom from multiple directions. And when the moment is right, when Mitanni is sufficiently weakened and distracted, he strikes. The Hittite army, reinforced with troops from vassal states and equipped with the latest military technology, sweeps south into Syria. City after city submits or is taken by force. The great commercial centers of Aleppo, Alak, and Carchemish come under Hittite control. The kingdom of Mitanni, once so powerful, is reduced to a rump state, a shadow of its former self. The most dramatic moment of this conquest comes when the king of Mitanni is assassinated in a palace coup, and his widow sends a desperate message to Egypt, to the pharaoh Akhenaten, begging for help. But Egypt is distracted by its own internal religious upheaval, by Akhenaten's radical religious reforms that have alienated the powerful priesthood. No help comes. The widow and her young son flee to Hittite territory, seeking Superpower's protection. He grants it, but on his terms. The boy is installed as a puppet king over what remains of Mitanni, now a vassal state of the Hittite Empire. The balance of power in the Near East has fundamentally shifted. Where once there were three great powers, Egypt, Mitanni, and Hittite, now there are only two, Egypt and Hittite, and they are on a collision course. But before that collision comes, something unprecedented happens. Akhenaten dies, and his young widow, a queen of Egypt whose name has been the subject of endless scholarly debate, but whom the Hittite sources call Dahamunzu, sends an extraordinary letter to Superpower. The letter is almost unbelievable. The queen of Egypt is asking the king of Hatti to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh of Egypt. Superpower is suspicious. This could be a trap, an attempt to lure a Hittite prince to Egypt, where he could be killed or held hostage. He sends an ambassador to Egypt to investigate. The ambassador returns with confirmation. The letter is genuine. The queen is desperate. She has no sons of her own, and the powerful officials and generals of Egypt are maneuvering to marry her to one of their own to legitimize their claims to the throne. She would rather marry a foreign prince than submit to being a pawn in the power struggles of the Egyptian court. Superpower, after much deliberation, decides to take the risk. He sends one of his sons, a young prince named Zananza, to Egypt with a small escort. It is a staggering opportunity. A Hittite prince on the throne of the most ancient and prestigious kingdom in the world would give the Hittites unquestioned supremacy. But the gamble fails. Zananza never reaches the queen. He is murdered on the journey, probably by agents of the Egyptian military faction that has no intention of allowing a foreigner to become pharaoh. When news of the murder reaches Hattusa, Superpower is enraged. He immediately launches a retaliatory campaign into Egyptian-controlled territory in Syria, capturing cities and taking prisoners. Among those prisoners are some who are carrying a plague, a disease that they bring back to Anatolia. The plague spreads through the Hittite kingdom with devastating effect. It rages for years, killing thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, and among its victims is Superpower himself. The great king who conquered an empire dies not in battle but of disease, a victim of the unintended consequences of his own success. His son and successor, Murmured II, inherits an empire at the height of its power but also facing serious challenges. The plague continues to ravage the population. Vassal states, sensing weakness, begin to rebel. The Egyptians, under a new dynasty, are reasserting their control over Syria. Murmured proves to be a capable ruler, a man who combines military skill with deep piety. He is troubled by the plague, seeing it as a sign of divine displeasure, and he consults priests and oracles to discover what sin has angered the gods. The answer, recorded in a remarkable series of texts known as the Plague Prayers of Murmured, is that the gods are angry because of oaths broken by Superpower during his conquests. Murmured performs elaborate rituals of atonement, making offerings, building temples, promising reforms. Whether because of these rituals or simply because the disease has run its course, the plague eventually subsides. With the crisis past, Murmured turns his attention to securing the empire's borders and reasserting Hittite authority. He campaigns in the west, in the land the Hittites call Azawa, in the region that will one day be known as Anatolia, conquering cities and deporting rebellious populations. He campaigns in the north, against the Kaska people, fierce mountain tribes who have been raiding Hittite territory for generations, pushing them back from the borders of the heartland. And he campaigns in the east, securing the frontier against Assyrian expansion. The empire is stabilized, its territories secured, its authority re-established. But the greatest test is yet to come, and it will fall not to Murmured but to his son, a king who will face the might of Egypt in the largest chariot battle ever fought. The year is 1274 before the Common Era, and the ancient world stands on the brink of its greatest military confrontation. Two empires, each convinced of its divine right to rule, each determined to control the wealthy cities of Syria, are marching toward an encounter that will echo through history. From the south comes the army of Egypt, led by its young and ambitious pharaoh, Ramesses II, a man determined to restore Egyptian power and prestige, to reclaim the territories lost during the religious upheavals of the previous generation. From the north comes the army of the Hittite Empire, commanded by King Muwatalid II, son of Murmured, a monarch who has inherited the strongest military machine in the Near East, and who will not tolerate Egyptian expansion into what he considers Hittite sphere of influence. The two forces are converging on a city in Syria, a place whose name will become synonymous with ancient warfare, Kadesh. You are with the Hittite army, as it makes its way south through the familiar territories of Syria. This is no raiding party or punitive expedition. This is the full military might of the empire mobilized for war. The great king has summoned troops from every corner of his realm and from every vassal state. The column that marches south is immense, perhaps the largest army the Hittites have ever fielded. At its core are the chariot forces, the aristocratic warriors who form the elite strike force. The Hittite chariot is heavier than those used by the Egyptians, designed to carry 3 men instead of 2, a driver who controls the horses, a warrior who wields the spear and javelin, and a shield bearer who protects both from enemy missiles. The chariots are built of wood, reinforced with bronze fittings, pulled by pairs of carefully bred horses, animals that have been trained for months to maintain formation under the chaos of combat. Surrounding and supporting the chariots are thousands of infantry, organized into units by their region of origin and by their weapon specialization. There are spearmen, carrying long bronze-tipped spears and large shields of wood covered with leather, sometimes reinforced with bronze bosses. There are archers, armed with composite bows made of wood, horn and sinew laminated together to create a weapon of tremendous power and range. There are slingers, men who can hurl stones or lead bullets with lethal accuracy. And there are support troops, engineers who will construct siege works if needed, servants who tend to the baggage train, cooks and camp followers, the invisible mass of people required to keep an army functional in the field. The total number is uncertain. Ancient sources are notoriously unreliable about such figures. But conservative modern estimates suggest at least 15 to 20,000 combat troops, possibly more. The march south takes weeks. The army follows the ancient routes through the Syrian highlands, through passes in the Lebanon mountains, through territories that are nominally under Hittite control, but where loyalty is always conditional, always dependent on who holds the strongest force. Scouts range ahead, watching for signs of the Egyptian army, gathering intelligence about their movements and strength. Messengers ride constantly between the main army and the vassal kings who are bringing their own contingents to join the muster. The logistics of keeping such a force supplied are staggering. Each man needs water, bread, and other provisions. The horses and draft animals need fodder. Equipment breaks and must be repaired. Discipline must be maintained. It is a test of organizational capability as much as military prowess. Finally, the scouts bring word. The Egyptian army has crossed into Syria and is approaching Kadesh from the south. Mu'attali makes his decision. He will make his stand at Kadesh, a strategically important city situated on the Orontes River, controlling the routes into both Egypt's Levantine territories and the Hittite sphere. The city itself is ancient, sitting atop a tell, an artificial mound created by thousands of years of continuous habitation. It is strongly fortified, and its king has wisely decided to align with the Hittites rather than face their wrath. Mu'attali positions his army carefully. He does not expose his forces on the open plain where the Egyptians might see them. Instead, he conceals the bulk of his troops beyond the city, on the far side of the Orontes, hidden from view, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Egyptian army approaches in 4 divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Reis, Ptah, and Seth. Ramesses himself commands the Amun division at the head of the column. The pharaoh is young, confident, and eager for glory. He has been told by captured scouts, who may have been deliberately allowed to be captured by the Hittites, and fed false information, that the Hittite army is still far to the north, near Aleppo, and that Kadesh is essentially undefended. This intelligence is catastrophically wrong. Believing it, Ramesses pushes ahead with just the Amun division, leaving the other 3 divisions strung out behind him on the march. He wants to reach Kadesh quickly, to set up camp and secure the city before the Hittites can arrive. It is a fatal mistake. As the Amun division begins to make camp on the plain northwest of Kadesh, the trap is sprung. The Hittite chariot forces, concealed behind the city, suddenly sweep around its flank and launch a devastating charge into the Red division, which is still on the march, strung out and vulnerable. The attack is perfectly timed and executed. The Egyptian troops, surprised and disorganized, break and flee in panic. The Hittite chariots pursue them, cutting down the fleeing soldiers, capturing standards and equipment. The The survivors run north toward the Ammon division, spreading panic as they come. Within minutes, the Red division has ceased to exist as a fighting force. You are in one of those Hittite chariots now. In the midst of the charge, the experience is one of controlled chaos. The chariot bounces and lurches over the uneven ground, the driver shouting to the horses, guiding them with voice and reins, keeping them in formation with the other chariots on either side. You are in the center of the chariot, gripping a spear, watching for targets. Beside you, the shield-bearer holds his large shield to protect against the arrows and javelins that Egyptian soldiers are desperately shooting at the advancing line. The air is filled with dust, thick clouds raised by thousands of horses' hooves and chariot wheels, dust that stings your eyes and catches in your throat. The sound is overwhelming, the thunder of wheels, the drumming of hooves, the war cries of men, the screams of the wounded and dying, the clash of bronze on bronze, the splintering of shattered chariots. As the fleeing Egyptians stream into the Ammon division's camp, the Hittite chariots follow close behind, smashing into the half-formed defensive lines. The Egyptian camp dissolves into chaos. Soldiers flee in every direction. Some run toward the river, throwing themselves into the water in their desperation to escape. Others try to rally around the pharaoh's standard. Ramesses himself, caught in the disaster of his own making, finds himself in desperate straits. According to Egyptian accounts, which are naturally biased in his favor, the pharaoh performs miracles of valor, personally fighting off attackers, rallying his bodyguard, charging again and again into the Hittite forces. The reality is probably less heroic, but no less dramatic. Ramesses, surrounded, fights for his life while his army disintegrates around him. But the Hittites, having achieved their surprise, make a critical error. Instead of maintaining formation and pressing the attack to annihilate the Egyptian force, many of the chariot warriors stop to loot the Egyptian camp. This is one of the perennial problems of ancient warfare, the difficulty of maintaining discipline and control once looting becomes possible. Soldiers who have spent weeks on campaign, who have marched hundreds of miles, who face death in every battle, cannot resist the temptation of immediate plunder. The Hittite chariots that should be pursuing the fleeing Egyptians are instead scattered through the camp, their crews grabbing gold, weapons, textiles, food, whatever they can carry. And this delay gives Ramesses the breathing space he desperately needs. A relief force arrives, the Neterin, a unit of elite Egyptian troops who had been marching separately from the main army, perhaps along the coast. They smash into the Hittite forces that are now disordered and distracted by their looting. The attack catches the Hittites by surprise, and suddenly the momentum shifts. The Hittite chariots, unable to reform quickly, are driven back in confusion. The battle becomes a swirling melee, units clashing and separating, the situation changing minute by minute. Muwatalli, commanding from his position near the city, still has the bulk of his infantry forces uncommitted. He could potentially throw them into the fight and crush the Egyptian army once and for all, but he holds back. Perhaps he is concerned about the other Egyptian divisions that are approaching from the south. Perhaps he is satisfied with the damage already inflicted on the Egyptians. Perhaps he simply does not want to risk his infantry in a battle that has become too chaotic to control effectively. Whatever his reasoning, he does not commit his reserves. As evening approaches, the two armies disengage. Both sides are exhausted, bloodied, and shaken. The battlefield is a scene of carnage, broken chariots, dead horses, the bodies of men from both armies scattered across the plain. The wounded cry out for water. Scavengers, both human and animal, begin to move among the debris as darkness falls. Neither side has achieved a decisive victory. The Egyptians have been badly mauled, have lost an entire division and much of their equipment, but they have not been destroyed. The Hittites have won a tactical victory, have demonstrated their military superiority, but they have not driven the Egyptians from Syria. The next day, the two armies face each other again, but neither is willing to risk another major engagement. Skirmishing occurs, but no general battle. And then as the other Egyptian divisions arrive and the relative strength of the forces becomes more equal, it becomes clear that there will be no decisive result. Ramesses withdraws south with what remains of his army. Muwatalli, content to have held Kadesh and demonstrated Hittite power, does not pursue. The Battle of Kadesh is over, but its consequences will reverberate for decades. In Egypt, Ramesses will proclaim it as a great victory, will have the story carved on temple walls throughout his kingdom, will commission poems and inscriptions celebrating his personal heroism. In Hatti, the battle will be remembered more quietly as a successful defense of the empire's interests, a demonstration that Egyptian expansion has been checked. Neither side has won a clear victory, and both know it. The war in Syria will continue for years, a grinding stalemate of sieges and skirmishes, raids and counter-raids, with neither empire able to gain a decisive advantage. And this stalemate will eventually lead both sides to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible before Kadesh, that peace is preferable to endless inconclusive warfare. That peace, when it comes, will be formalized in a document that is itself a kind of monument to the battle that made it necessary. 16 years after the Battle of Kadesh, in the 21st year of the reign of Ramesses II, a treaty is concluded between Egypt and Hatti. It is negotiated between Ramesses and Hattusa III, who has succeeded his brother Muwatalli as great king. The treaty is unprecedented in its scope and formality. It is not merely a temporary truce, but a permanent peace, a mutual recognition of borders and spheres of influence, a commitment to mutual defense, and an agreement to extradite fugitives and political refugees. The text is inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Akkadian cuneiform on both clay tablets and in silver, with copies kept in the temples and archives of both kingdoms. It is in every sense the world's first international peace treaty, and it will hold for the rest of the Bronze Age, binding these two great powers in peace when war between them had seemed eternal. But to understand how the Hittites could negotiate such a sophisticated diplomatic instrument, we must understand the legal and cultural framework that underpinned their society. The Hittites were not mere warriors. They were builders of institutions, creators of legal codes, keepers of vast archives, and practitioners of a complex religious system that linked the earthly king to the divine order. Let us step away now from the clash of armies and enter into the quieter but equally important realm of law and belief, of the rules that governed daily life, and the rituals that connected the human world to the realm of the gods. The legal system of the Hittite Empire is known to us from collections of laws preserved on clay tablets, texts that were copied and recopied by generations of scribes, carefully preserved in the archives at Hattusa. These laws are not systematic legal codes in the modern sense, but rather collections of case precedents, examples of how specific situations should be handled, guidelines for judges to follow when administering justice. They cover a remarkable range of situations: property disputes, theft, assault, murder, sexual offenses, agricultural matters, disputes involving slaves and free persons, prices for goods and services, compensation for injuries. What is striking about these laws, especially when compared to some other ancient legal codes, is their relative humanity and practicality. The death penalty, for example, is prescribed far less frequently than in many contemporary legal systems. Most offenses can be resolved through compensation paid to the injured party. If you injure someone in a fight, you must pay for their medical treatment and compensate them for lost work time. If you steal property, you must restore it and pay a fine. If you kill someone accidentally, you must pay compensation to their family. Even some cases of intentional murder can be resolved through payment rather than execution, though this depends on the circumstances and the social status of the victim and perpetrator. There is a clear recognition that different classes of people have different legal standing. A free person's life is valued more highly than a slave's. A nobleman's injury requires greater compensation than a commoner's, but there is also an insistence that even slaves have some legal protections, that even the powerful cannot act with complete impunity. The laws also reveal fascinating details about daily life and social customs. We learn about marriage practices, about the complex rules governing who can marry whom, about bride prices and dowries, about the rights of women to own property and seek divorce under certain circumstances. We learn about agricultural practices, about the rules for grazing animals on common land, about the prices expected for various goods and services. We learn about religious observances, about the penalties for neglecting the proper rituals, about the importance of maintaining temples and performing festivals at the correct times. These are not abstract philosophical texts but practical guides to living in Hittite society, the accumulated wisdom of generations translated into legal principles. The administration of justice was a responsibility that fell ultimately on the king. Though in practice most cases were handled by local officials and judges, The king was expected to be the guarantor of justice, the protector of the weak against the powerful, the one who ensured that the laws were applied fairly. This was not merely a practical political necessity, but a religious obligation. The king ruled by divine mandate, and that mandate required him to maintain Mat, the cosmic order, to ensure that the world functioned according to the proper principles. A king who failed in this duty, who allowed injustice to flourish, who broke the sacred oaths he had sworn, risked bringing divine punishment, not just on himself but on his entire kingdom. The plague prayers of Mursili II, which we mentioned earlier, are a powerful expression of this belief. The plague is sent by the gods because of oaths broken by the previous king, and only through ritual expiation and renewed commitment to justice can the divine anger be appeased. Religion permeated every aspect of Hittite life. The Hittites worshipped what they called the 1,000 gods, a vast pantheon that included deities inherited from the indigenous Hatti people, gods brought by the Indo-European ancestors of the ruling elite, and deities borrowed or adopted from neighboring cultures. This was not seen as contradictory but as natural and appropriate. Different gods had different spheres of influence, different powers and responsibilities. To honor them all, to maintain good relations with the entire divine realm, was simply good sense. The supreme deity of the Hittite pantheon was the storm god, often called Teshub, a deity of thunder and rain, of fertility and kingship. He was the king of the gods just as the earthly king was the ruler of men, and the relationship between them was understood as a kind of parallel or mirror. The storm god's consort was the sun goddess of Arina, a powerful female deity associated with the sun, with sovereignty, with the sacred aspects of queenship. Below these supreme deities were hundreds of other gods, each with their own cults, their own festivals, their own particular requirements for worship. There were gods of mountains and rivers, gods of agriculture and craftsmanship, gods of war and plague, gods of the underworld and the sky. Every city had its own patron deities, every profession had gods who watched over it. Every important aspect of life was connected to the divine realm. And the Hittites were scrupulous, even anxious, in their religious observances, fearful that any neglect, any failure to perform the proper rituals at the proper times, might anger a god and bring disaster. The king himself was the high priest of the realm, responsible for performing the most important state rituals. These were elaborate ceremonies, sometimes lasting days or even weeks, involving processions, sacrifices, libations, ritual meals, sacred dramas performed in temples. The king would be purified through ritual bathing, dressed in sacred garments, anointed with holy oils. He would offer bread and beer, wine and oil, meat from sacrificed animals to the cult images of the gods. He would pray for the prosperity of the land, for victory in war, for his own health and the health of his family. These were not optional ceremonies but essential duties, acts of maintenance that kept the cosmic order functioning, that maintained the compact between the divine and human realms. The most sacred site in the Hittite realm was not in Hattusa itself but at a rocky sanctuary in the hills nearby, a place we call today by its Turkish name, Yazilikaya, the inscribed rock. Here in a natural outcropping of limestone, ancient sculptors carved a remarkable gallery of divine images. You walk through a narrow cleft in the rock and emerge into a chamber open to the sky, its walls covered with carved reliefs showing the entire Hittite pantheon in procession. On one side are the male gods, led by the storm god standing on the backs of two mountain gods personified as men. On the other side are the female deities, led by the sun goddess. The two processions meet at the back of the chamber, where the supreme deities are shown in larger scale, emphasizing their importance. The carving is not highly realistic by the standards of classical art, but it is powerful and evocative. These serried ranks of deities, each identified by hieroglyphic symbols, each carrying their characteristic attributes, marching eternally through the sacred stone. This was a place of pilgrimage, a site where the most important rituals were performed, perhaps during the great spring festival when the king would renew his covenant with the gods, when the divine world and the human world were understood to come into closest contact. To stand here, in this rocky amphitheater, surrounded by the images of gods whose names are now mostly forgotten, whose cults have been dead for 3 millennia, is to touch something of the spiritual intensity of the Hittite world, their profound sense that they lived in a universe crowded with divine powers, powers that had to be acknowledged, honored, and appeased. The intellectual and cultural life of the Hittites is preserved for us in their archives. those vast collections of clay tablets that were stored in the palace and temples of Hattusa. The archives contained administrative documents, inventories of tribute received from vassal states, records of rations distributed to workers, lists of military equipment, diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers. But they also contained literary texts, myths and legends, ritual instructions, hymns and prayers, historical annals recording the deeds of kings, even collections of omens used for divination. The scribes who created and maintained these archives were highly trained professionals, men who had spent years learning to write in cuneiform script, mastering not just their native Hittite language, but also Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy and scholarship, and often Sumerian as well, the ancient language of Mesopotamia that was still used for certain specialized texts. These archives reveal a civilization that was literate, bureaucratic, and cosmopolitan. The Hittites were in constant communication with the other great powers of their age, exchanging letters with the pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Babylon and Assyria, the rulers of smaller states. They copied and adapted literary texts from Mesopotamia, including versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. They preserved native Hittite myths, stories of how the gods established order in the cosmos, tales of divine conflict and resolution. They recorded their own history, not always accurately, but with a sense that the past mattered, that the deeds of earlier kings set precedents and established patterns that current rulers should follow or avoid. This was a culture that valued knowledge, that believed understanding the past and maintaining proper relations with both the divine and earthly powers was essential to maintaining order and prosperity. But law and religion alone do not explain the Hittite achievement. To understand how this civilization rose to such prominence, we must also appreciate their mastery of practical technologies and their sophisticated approach to international relations. The Hittites were innovators in metallurgy, architecture, and military technology, and they were among the first peoples to understand that empires could be maintained not just through force, but through carefully calibrated systems of diplomacy, treaty obligations, and strategic marriages. The Hittite mastery of ironworking has already been mentioned, but it deserves deeper consideration. Iron was not unknown in the Bronze Age. Small amounts of meteoric iron were occasionally worked into ceremonial objects, but the Hittites were among the first to develop techniques for extracting iron from terrestrial ores and working it into useful tools and weapons. The process was difficult, and the results inconsistent. Iron ore must be heated to extremely high temperatures in a charcoal fire, higher than the temperatures needed for copper or bronze. The resulting bloom of iron is not pure but is mixed with slag and impurities that must be hammered out through repeated heating and forging. The process is labor-intensive and requires considerable skill, and even when done correctly, the resulting iron is often brittle and prone to rust unless properly maintained. But iron has one tremendous advantage over bronze: abundance. Copper and tin, the ingredients of bronze, are relatively rare and must be imported over long distances. The tin mines that supplied the Bronze Age civilizations were located in distant regions, and control of the tin trade was a strategic necessity for any great power. Iron ore, by contrast, is common, found in many different geological formations. A kingdom with the knowledge to work iron effectively could arm its soldiers much more cheaply than one dependent on imported bronze. This gave the Hittites a significant advantage, and they guarded the secrets of ironworking jealously. In their diplomatic correspondence, gifts of iron objects are mentioned as particular marks of royal favor, valuable precisely because they cannot be obtained elsewhere. In architecture and engineering, the Hittites were masters of stone construction. The walls of Hattusa are among the most impressive fortifications of the ancient world, built using a technique called Cyclopean masonry, where massive blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, are fitted together without mortar. These walls extended for kilometers, enclosing not just the citadel but the entire lower city, climbing the hillsides and following the natural contours of the land. The gates in these walls were marvels of defensive architecture, multiple chambers that attacking forces would have to pass through, murder holes in the ceilings where defenders could rain down missiles on anyone who breached the outer gates, and massive wooden doors reinforced with bronze that could be barred from the inside. The most famous of these gates is the Lion Gate, where two stone lions, carved in powerful relief, flank the entrance, their mouths open in eternal roars, symbols of the power and vigilance of the Hittite state. Similar gates featured sphinxes or warrior gods, all carved with a distinctive Hittite style that blends realistic detail with symbolic power. But the fortifications were not merely for show. They were functional defenses designed to withstand siege, with towers for archers, sally ports for counterattacks, and sophisticated water management systems that ensured the city could not be starved of water during a prolonged siege. Water engineering was in fact one of the Hittites' great achievements. Hattusa was built in a region where water was precious, and ensuring an adequate supply for the large population was a constant challenge. The Hittites constructed elaborate systems of reservoirs, channels, and underground conduits to collect and distribute water. Some of these channels were carved directly into bedrock, running for hundreds of meters underground to bring water from distant springs to storage cisterns within the city walls. Other systems collected rainwater from the roofs and courtyards of buildings, channeling it into storage facilities for use during the dry summer months. These were engineering projects that required careful surveying, skilled stone cutting, and coordinated labor over many years, testament to the organizational capacity of the Hittite state. In military technology, beyond the development of iron weapons, the Hittites were known for their sophisticated chariotry. The Hittite war chariot, as we have noted, was heavier and carried more men than the lighter Egyptian model. This reflected a different tactical philosophy. The Egyptian chariot was designed for speed and mobility, a platform for archers who would dash in, shoot their arrows, and retreat before the enemy could respond. The Hittite chariot was designed as a shock weapon, a platform for close combat. The third man in the chariot, the shield bearer, allowed the warrior to fight more effectively in melee, protected from missiles while wielding his spear. When hundreds of these heavy chariots charged in formation, the impact could be devastating, smashing through enemy lines through sheer mass and momentum. But technological sophistication alone does not build empires. The Hittites also understood the arts of diplomacy and the value of creating stable, long-term relationships with both equals and subordinates. Their approach to international relations was remarkably sophisticated, based on a clear hierarchy of states and formalized through written treaties that spelled out mutual obligations. At the top of the hierarchy were the great kings, the rulers of the major powers, the Hittite king himself, the pharaoh of Egypt, the kings of Babylon and Assyria. These rulers addressed each other as brothers, acknowledging their equal status, even when relations were tense. Below them were lesser kings who ruled independent states, but acknowledged the supremacy of one of the great powers, addressing the great king as father and receiving the title of son in return. And below them were the vassal rulers, local kings and chieftains who had sworn oaths of loyalty and who were expected to provide troops and tribute in exchange for protection and the right to keep their thrones. These relationships were formalized through treaties, documents that were remarkably detailed and sophisticated. A typical vassal treaty would spell out the obligations of the vassal to provide troops when called upon, to pay annual tribute, to extradite fugitives, to refuse passage to the enemies of the great king, to report any conspiracy or rebellion. It would also spell out the protections the vassal could expect: military support against enemies, confirmation in his throne, the right to pass his kingdom to his heirs. The treaty would invoke the gods of both parties as witnesses and guarantors, with elaborate curses calling down divine punishment on anyone who broke the terms. And copies of the treaty would be deposited in temples in both kingdoms, read aloud publicly, so that everyone knew the terms, a form of public accountability that made violations more difficult to excuse. This treaty system was not merely theoretical. We have dozens of these documents preserved in the Hittite archives, and we can trace how they functioned in practice. When a vassal rebelled, the great king would cite the terms of the treaty in his justification for military action. When a vassal remained loyal, that loyalty would be rewarded with gifts, with increased authority, sometimes with territorial gains at the expense of less reliable neighbors. The system created a web of obligations and expectations that helped stabilize the empire, making it clear to everyone what was expected and what the consequences of loyalty or betrayal would be. The Hittites also used marriage as a diplomatic tool with considerable sophistication. Royal daughters were married to vassal kings, creating family ties that were expected to strengthen loyalty. These were not love matches, but calculated political alliances, and the correspondence between courts sometimes reveals the hard bargaining that went on: demands for appropriate dowries, insistence on proper treatment of the princess, threats of military action if the terms were not respected. But the system worked, creating networks of kinship that cross-cut political boundaries and gave royal families a personal stake in maintaining good relations. Perhaps the most remarkable example of Hittite diplomacy is the treaty with Egypt following the Battle of Kadesh, the treaty we mentioned earlier. This was not a vassal treaty, but a treaty between equals, acknowledging that neither power could defeat the other and that peace was in the interests of both. The terms were carefully negotiated to preserve the dignity of both parties. Neither king had to admit defeat. The borders in Syria were recognized, with each power retaining what it currently controlled. Both sides agreed to mutual defense. If Egypt were attacked by a third party, Hatti would provide military assistance, and vice versa. There were provisions for the extradition of fugitives, ensuring that neither kingdom would become a refuge for political exiles from the other. And the treaty was sealed with a royal marriage. A Hittite princess was sent to Egypt to become one of Ramesses' many wives, a living symbol of the peace between the two kingdoms. The treaty held for the rest of the Bronze Age, through the reigns of multiple kings in both kingdoms. It established a precedent for peaceful coexistence between great powers, demonstrating that war was not inevitable, that disputes could be resolved through negotiation, that mutual interests could be recognized and honored. In this sense, the Hittite diplomatic achievement was as significant as any of their military victories. They showed that empire could be maintained not just through force but through law, through negotiation, through the patient building of relationships and institutions. It was a lesson that would be forgotten in the chaos that was to come, but that would be rediscovered by later empires, and that remains relevant even today. This sophisticated system of law, religion, technology, and diplomacy created one of the most successful states of the Bronze Age, an empire that lasted for centuries, that governed diverse populations, that maintained order and prosperity across a vast territory. The Hittite achievement was real and substantial, but it rested on foundations that were more fragile than anyone at the time understood. The Bronze Age world was an interconnected system, dependent on trade networks that spanned thousands of miles, on the peaceful exchange of goods and ideas, on the stability of the major powers. When that system began to break down, when multiple disasters struck simultaneously, even the mightiest empires would prove vulnerable, and the Hittites, for all their strength and sophistication, would not be spared. The signs of trouble begin subtly, so gradually that at first they might seem like temporary setbacks, normal fluctuations in the fortune of empires. But they accumulate and they accelerate, and within a few generations the entire Bronze Age world will be transformed beyond recognition. The collapse of the Hittite Empire is not an isolated event but part of a wider catastrophe that affects the entire Eastern Mediterranean, a cascading failure of the interconnected system that has sustained Bronze Age civilization for centuries. To understand how the Hittites fell, we must understand this broader context, the convergence of disasters that no single kingdom, no matter how powerful, could withstand alone. The first signs appear in the reign of Tudalia IV, in the late 13th century before the Common Era. The king's correspondence reveals growing anxiety about food supplies, requests sent to vassal states and to Egypt asking for grain shipments to feed the population of Hattusa. These are not casual requests but urgent appeals, suggesting that the normal agricultural production of the Hittite heartland is failing. The cause is not explicitly stated in the texts, but modern climate research suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean was entering a period of sustained drought, a shift in rainfall patterns that would last for decades, making agriculture increasingly unreliable. Crop failures lead to food shortages lead to hunger and unrest, and hunger makes populations vulnerable to disease and less able to resist external threats. At the same time, the frontiers of the empire are under increasing pressure. In the west, in the lands along the Aegean coast, there are reports of raids and unrest, of movements of population that are destabilizing the vassal kingdoms that owe allegiance to Hatti. In the north, the Kaska people, those mountain tribes who have been a persistent thorn in the side of the Hittite state for centuries, are growing bolder, pushing further into Hittite territory. And in the east, the kingdom of Assyria, which had been relatively quiet during the period of peace with Egypt, is beginning to expand again, pressuring the Hittite sphere of influence in northern Mesopotamia. The empire is being squeezed from multiple directions, and the resources needed to respond to these threats are being stretched thin. But the most ominous threat, the one that appears in the documents with increasing frequency, is something the texts call the Sea Peoples. This is not a single ethnic group, but apparently a coalition of different populations, people who are themselves displaced by the wider crisis, who are moving by land and sea, raiding coastal cities, disrupting trade routes, spreading chaos in their wake. The exact identity of these Sea Peoples has been debated by scholars for generations. The Egyptian sources list names: the Shurdan, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Danaan. Some of these names might correspond to later known populations: the Peliset, possibly becoming the Philistines, the Shekelesh, perhaps related to Sicily. But in the context of the Bronze Age collapse, their precise origins matter less than their impact. They are a symptom and a cause of the wider breakdown: displaced populations who become raiders and invaders, who destabilize kingdoms already weakened by drought and economic stress. You are in Hattusa now, in the final years of the 13th century, and you can feel the anxiety in the air. The city that once seemed impregnable, protected by its massive walls and its powerful army, now feels besieged. Troops are being pulled from distant garrisons to defend the heartland. Grain stores are being carefully rationed. There are rumors of cities burned in the west, of fleets of ships carrying armed raiders, of kingdoms that have fallen silent, their last messages desperate calls for help that could not be answered. The great trading network that once brought wealth to Hattusa is breaking down. Ships are not arriving with their cargoes of luxury goods. Caravans are not bringing tin from the east, copper from Cyprus, ivory and exotic woods from the south. The empire is beginning to contract, pulling back from its more distant possessions, trying to hold on to the core territories. The king Supilium II, the last great king of Hatti, whose name we know, makes desperate efforts to stem the tide. He campaigns in the west, trying to restore order in the coastal regions. In one text he boasts of a naval victory, describing how Hittite ships defeated enemy fleets in the seas off Cyprus. It is the only record we have of a Hittite naval battle, and it may represent an attempt to keep the sea lanes open, to maintain contact with Cyprus, that crucial source of copper that is essential for bronze production. But victories in individual battles cannot stop the larger forces at work. The drought continues. The raiders keep coming. The empire continues to weaken. And then, in the early years of the 12th century before the Common Era, catastrophe strikes. Hattusa is attacked, overwhelmed, and burned. We do not know exactly who destroyed it. The documentary evidence ends before the final fall. There are no archives describing the last battle, no king's annals recording the defeat. What we have instead is the archaeological evidence, a thick layer of ash and burned debris covering the palace and the temples, the massive walls breached in several places, evidence of intense fire that brought the roofs crashing down, that baked the clay tablets in the archives hard enough to preserve them for 3 millennia, even as the city they documented was destroyed. The excavators found arrowheads lodged in walls, evidence of fierce fighting. They found bodies left unburied, a sign of chaos and breakdown of normal customs. They found evidence that valuable items had been hastily buried or hidden, suggesting that the inhabitants knew the end was coming and tried desperately to save what they could. After the destruction, Hattusa was never rebuilt. The survivors, if there were any, abandoned the site. The great capital, the city that had been the heart of an empire for 400 years, became a ghost town, its temples empty, its palaces roofless and open to the sky, its streets silent. Within a generation, the memory of who had lived there and what they had accomplished began to fade. The Hittite Empire did not gradually decline, it collapsed suddenly and completely, disappearing so thoroughly that future generations would know it only as a name in ancient texts, if they knew it at all. But Hattusa's fall was not an isolated event. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze Age world was dying. In Mycenaean Greece, the great palace centers Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns were burning. The Linear B tablets that recorded their administrative functions break off suddenly, mid-sentence in some cases, never to resume. In Cyprus, major cities were destroyed. Along the coast of Syria and the Levant, site after site shows evidence of violent destruction in this same period. Ugarit, that great trading city whose archives preserve so much of our knowledge of Bronze Age diplomacy and literature, was utterly destroyed, burned so thoroughly that even its name was forgotten until modern archaeologists rediscovered the site. In Egypt, Ramesses III, ruling in the early 12th century, faced massive invasions by land and sea. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu preserves dramatic reliefs showing the battles, sea battles where Egyptian ships fight against enemy vessels loaded with warriors, their families and possessions visible in the ships, suggesting these are not mere raiders but entire populations on the move. Land battles show Egyptian troops fighting against coalition forces of different peoples. Ramesses claims victory, and Egypt does survive where many others fall, but it is a diminished Egypt, cut off from its empire in Asia, retreating into its Nile Valley heartland, entering a long period of weakness and division. The causes of this collapse are still debated. Climate change and drought are clearly part of the explanation, making agriculture unreliable, creating food shortages that destabilize societies. The movements of the sea peoples, whether as cause or effect of the wider crisis, disrupted trade and spread destruction. Systems collapse theory suggests that the Bronze Age kingdoms were so interconnected, so dependent on long-distance trade for essential materials like tin and copper, that disruption in one area could cascade through the entire network. When ships stopped sailing, when caravans stopped traveling, when trade routes became too dangerous to use, kingdoms that depended on imported materials for bronze production were suddenly unable to equip their armies, unable to maintain their technological advantage, vulnerable to attack by peoples who might be less sophisticated but who had iron weapons and nothing left to lose. Earthquake storms, sequences of major earthquakes affecting the eastern Mediterranean, may have destroyed cities and disrupted food production. Epidemic disease, spreading through populations weakened by hunger, may have killed thousands and further destabilized social structures. Political factors, including internal rebellions and succession disputes that weakened states at exactly the moment when they needed to be strongest, played their part. Likely it was not any single cause but a convergence of disasters, a perfect storm of problems that individually might have been manageable but together were overwhelming. The result was the end of the Bronze Age world as it had existed. The great palace bureaucracies collapsed, writing systems were lost. Millennia B in Greece, Hittite cuneiform in Anatolia, other scripts elsewhere. Trade networks broke down, populations declined dramatically, cities were abandoned. In many regions, people reverted to simpler agricultural communities, village-based societies without the elaborate hierarchies and institutions of the Bronze Age kingdoms. It was not a complete return to prehistoric conditions. Some technologies were preserved, some cultural traditions continued, but it was a dramatic simplification, a loss of complexity and sophistication that would take centuries to recover. For the Hittites specifically, the end of the empire did not mean the complete disappearance of their culture. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, a series of smaller kingdoms emerged, sometimes called the Neo-Hittite states or Syro-Hittite kingdoms. These were ruled by dynasties that claimed descent from the Hittite royal family or that adopted Hittite cultural forms. They used a hieroglyphic script for writing their Luwian language, a language related to Hittite that had been spoken in parts of the empire. They maintained some Hittite religious traditions and artistic styles. Cities like Carchemish, Melid, and Hamath became centers of these successor kingdoms, maintaining some connection to the Hittite past even as they adapted to the new realities of the Iron Age. But these Neo-Hittite kingdoms were small, regional powers, nothing like the great empire that had negotiated with Egypt as an equal, that had commanded armies of tens of thousands, that had ruled from Anatolia to the Euphrates. They would eventually fall to the expanding Assyrian Empire in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. Absorbed into new power structures, their distinctive identity gradually lost. The great Hittite Empire, the empire of Sapaluluma and Muwatalli, the empire that had fought at Kadesh and signed the first peace treaty, was gone, and with its passing, the memory of its achievements began to fade into legend and myth. For nearly 3,000 years, the Hittites were lost to history. Their cities crumbled into ruin, their language became unreadable, their very name became a puzzle. The Hebrew Bible mentions the Hittites repeatedly, listing them among the peoples of ancient Canaan, describing them as one of the nations that the Israelites encountered. But these biblical Hittites seem to be a minor local population, not a great empire. Ancient Greek and Roman writers had no knowledge of a Hittite empire. The classical civilizations that arose in the Mediterranean after the Bronze Age collapse built on Egyptian and Mesopotamian foundations. but knew nothing of the Hittites as a major power. The great empire had been so thoroughly erased that later scholars, reading the biblical references, sometimes doubted whether the Hittites had existed at all, or speculated that they were merely a small tribal group that the Bible had mentioned in passing. The rediscovery began in the 19th century, that great age of archaeological exploration and imperial adventure. European scholars and adventurers traveling through the Ottoman Empire began to notice strange ruins in the highlands of Anatolia, massive stone walls in places far from any known ancient civilization, stone reliefs carved in a style that seemed neither Greek nor Persian nor Mesopotamian. In the 1830s, a French scholar named Charles Texier stumbled upon the ruins of a great ancient city near the village of Boğazkale in central Turkey. The site was massive, with walls extending for kilometers, gates flanked by carved lions and sphinxes, the foundations of monumental buildings visible among the tumbled stones. Local people called it Hattusa, but Texier had no idea what civilization had built it. He documented what he saw and moved on. More discoveries followed. In northern Syria, at places like Carchemish and Hamath, travelers found stone monuments covered in an unknown script, a kind of hieroglyphic writing that bore no obvious relationship to Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. These inscriptions, carved on stone stelae and rock reliefs, were tantalizing hints of a lost civilization, but without the ability to read them, they remained mysterious. Scholars began to suspect that these various discoveries, the ruins at Boğazkale, the hieroglyphic inscriptions in Syria, the biblical references to Hittites, might all be related, that they might be evidence of a major civilization that had somehow been completely forgotten. The breakthrough came at the end of the 19th century. In 1887, a cache of clay tablets was discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, the site of Pharaoh Akhenaten's short-lived capital. These tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, turned out to be the diplomatic archives of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, containing letters exchanged between the pharaohs and the rulers of other Near Eastern kingdoms in the 14th century before the Common Era. Among the correspondence were the great kings of Arzawa, and references to a kingdom called Hatti. The tablets proved that there had been a major power in Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age, a power that communicated with Egypt as an equal. The search intensified. In 1906, a German archaeological expedition led by Hugo Winkler began excavating at Boğazkale, the site that Texier had visited 70 years earlier. What they found was astonishing: the ruins of a great capital city, exactly as Texier had described, but also something even more precious: archives. Thousands of clay tablets, written in cuneiform script, preserved in the ruins of what had been administrative buildings and temples. The tablets had been baked hard by the fires that destroyed the city, inadvertently preserving them. Here, buried in the ruins, was the library and archive of a great empire. Here were royal annals, diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, legal codes, administrative records, everything needed to reconstruct the history of a lost civilization. But there was a problem: the language was unknown. Some of the tablets were in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language, and these could be read immediately. They confirmed that this was indeed Hattusa, the capital of Hatti, the kingdom mentioned in the Amarna letters, but most of the tablets were in another language, written phonetically using cuneiform signs, but following a grammar and vocabulary that did not match any known language. This was Hittite, the language of the empire, and deciphering it would be one of the great achievements of early 20th century scholarship. The key breakthrough came in 1915, when a Czech scholar named Bedřich Hrozený, working in Vienna during the First World War, made a crucial insight. He recognized that Hittite was an Indo-European language, related to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and the Germanic languages. This was revolutionary. It proved that Indo-European speakers had been in Anatolia since at least the second millennium before the Common Era, and it provided the key to decipherment. Once scholars understood the basic structure of the language, progress was rapid. Within a few decades, the Hittite tablets could be read, and the history they contained could be reconstructed. What emerged from those clay tablets was the revelation of a great empire that had been completely forgotten. Here were the annals of kings like Suppiluliuma and Mursili, describing their conquests, their diplomatic triumphs, their struggles. Here was the text of the treaty with Egypt, the oldest known international peace treaty, the document that had been mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions, but whose Hittite version had been lost for 3 millennia. Here were legal codes, religious texts, myths, administrative documents, the entire bureaucratic and cultural machinery of a major Bronze Age state. The Hittites, who had been barely more than a name, were suddenly revealed as one of the great powers of ancient history, worthy to stand alongside Egypt and Babylon. The excavations at Hattusa have continued, on and off, for more than a century now. Turkish and German archaeologists have uncovered the Great Temple, an enormous religious complex covering several acres, with storerooms still containing huge ceramic vessels that once held grain, oil, and wine for ritual use. They have excavated the royal citadel with its massive fortifications and administrative buildings. They have explored the lower city, tracing the street plan, identifying residential quarters and workshop districts. They have documented the massive city walls, with their gates decorated with sphinxes, warriors, and lions, and they have found more tablets, thousands more, adding constantly to our knowledge of Hittite history and culture. Other Hittite sites have been excavated as well. Alakahoyuk with its spectacular royal tombs from the early Bronze Age. Kultepe, the site of the ancient city of Kadesh, where Assyrian merchants established a trading colony in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, leaving behind archives that document the commercial networks that preceded the rise of the Hittite state. Yazilikaya, that open-air rock sanctuary with its carved procession of gods. Each new excavation, each new discovery, adds detail to the picture, filling in gaps in our understanding, occasionally overturning previous assumptions, constantly refining and enriching the story. The hieroglyphic script found on monuments in Syria and southern Anatolia was finally deciphered in the 1930s and 1940s, proving to be a different writing system used for a related language, Luwian. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms, those successors to the empire that survived in Syria and southeastern Anatolia, used this script, and reading it has allowed scholars to trace the survival and transformation of Hittite culture in the Iron Age. Every few years, it seems, some new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. A new inscription is found. A new cache of tablets is uncovered in a previously unexcavated area of Hattusa. A new site is identified as a Hittite city mentioned in the texts but whose location was previously unknown. The rediscovery of the Hittites is an ongoing process, a conversation between modern archaeologists and ancient scribes whose words have survived the millennia. So what is the legacy of the Hittites? What did they contribute to the development of civilization? What do they teach us about the human past? In concrete terms, their achievements are substantial. They were pioneers in ironworking, developing techniques that would eventually spread across the ancient world and usher in the Iron Age. Their legal codes show a sophisticated understanding of justice and social order, with provisions that in some ways seem remarkably humane by the standards of their time. Their diplomatic practices, their use of written treaties as instruments of international relations, established precedents that later civilizations would follow. The Hittite-Egyptian peace treaty was not just the first of its kind, but a model for how conflicts between great powers could be resolved through negotiation rather than endless warfare. Their architecture and engineering left a visible mark on the landscape. The Cyclopean walls of Hattusa still stand, weathered by 30 centuries, but still impressive, a testament to their skill in working stone. The rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya, with its carved procession of gods, remains one of the most evocative religious sites from the ancient world. Their artistic style, distinctive and powerful, influenced the cultures that succeeded them in Anatolia and Syria. But perhaps their greatest legacy is less tangible. The story of the Hittites teaches us about the fragility of civilization, about how even the mightiest empires can vanish, how knowledge can be lost, how memory itself can fail. For 3,000 years, one of the great powers of the Bronze Age was forgotten, known only from fragmentary biblical references that scholars sometimes doubted. The recovery of their history is a triumph of archaeology and scholarship, a reminder that the past is not entirely lost, that patient work can recover voices that have been silent for millennia, that there are still discoveries to be made, still stories to be told. The Hittites also remind us of the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations. They were not isolated, but part of a complex web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that linked the Mediterranean world to Mesopotamia and beyond. Their collapse was part of a system-wide failure, a cascading disaster that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean. In this sense, their story is particularly relevant to our own age, When we too live in an interconnected global system, when we too face challenges, climate change, resource depletion, epidemic disease, that no single nation can address alone, when we too must learn to cooperate or risk system-wide failure. And finally, the Hittites teach us humility about our own certainties. If an empire as powerful and sophisticated as theirs could be so completely forgotten, what other civilizations might have been lost? What achievements, what knowledge, what stories have vanished without trace? The written records that survive from the ancient world are a tiny fraction of what once existed. For every clay tablet that was preserved by being baked in a destroying fire, there are thousands that dissolved back into mud. For every stone inscription that survived the centuries, there are monuments that were broken up for building material or worn away by weather. We reconstruct ancient history from fragments, making the best guesses we can from incomplete evidence, always aware that new discoveries might overturn our theories, that there are vast areas of the past that remain dark to us, unknown and perhaps unknowable.